Hello and welcome to You Lovers, the podcast where we dive into the stories and songs that made us all fall in love with the Manic Street Preachers. Let's start off with a bit of full disclosure. I am a massive Manics fan. Okay, to say that they changed my life would be a bit of an understatement. I think we all have those moments where we came across them as a band and went, oh, something just tripped in our psyche, in our soul, whatever you want to call it. But we'll move on to that later on in the series. Talking of that, I'd love to hear your stories. Contact us here. Come on the podcast. Talk about what they mean to you, how you found them. Just whatever your story is, reach out. So I'm going to assume you're all sitting comfortably. We're going to put on our eyeliner now, get some leopard print, and grab our white Les Paul. I'm going to start where all good stories start, at the beginning. So this is the story of four boys who grew up in a small mining town called Blackwood in South Wales. James Dean Bradfield, Sean Moore, Nicky Wire and Richie Edwards. Four boys that, apart from James and Sean, who knew each other because they were family, but four boys that when they started the journey in life had no idea that they would become one of the greatest bands ever to grace the face of this earth. So their hometown of Blackwood, it was a mining town that was decimated by the death of the mining industry in this country and in England and Wales. An industry that was allowed to die by Thatcherism and conservative mismanagement and misrule for years and years and years. Anyone that was alive at those times will remember that the Conservative manifesto of consumerism certainly wasn't aimed at the working classes, at the people that would be at the coal face or on the factory floor. And because of this, Blackwood struggled. Blackwood became a hot spot of unemployment, of social disillusionment, and produced a generation of young boys and girls, men and women, who would become politically frustrated at how their town, how their parents, their forefathers had been treated. In 1994 in Q magazine, James Dean Bradfield described Blackwood as a grey, depressing place. We weren't street kids, but we felt like there was no future there. It's such a shame what happened to Blackwood. It was a vibrant and lively community at one point. There was the Charterist movement that was there. There was the mining social club. There were all of these things. There were other people that came from Blackwood. Steve Strange, who was the lead singer from Visage, came from Blackwood, or so he alleges. But what happened was similar to what happened in the late 70s and early 80s in the Midlands with the death and decline of the British car-making industry, that we saw unemployment rise within communities at disproportionate rates, which disenfranchised younger people who were on the cusp of looking for work, who were looking to start careers, who were looking to provide and build their own families. And that resulted in the political movements which became popular under bands like UB40. Their song 1 in 10 was a damning indictment of the 10% unemployment at that time. In the 70s, there'd been bands like The Clash that had mixed politics into their music, had mixed that anti-racism, anti-government feeling into their music. And that was a theme which ran through punk. So by the time we got to the early 80s and we had all the issues in Blackwood, you could see why that would then be a breeding ground for youth struggle, youth, misalignment. They didn't get what they were sold. They were told that you leave school and no matter how many government schemes aim to rejuvenate the area with retail parks and business parks and all that you wouldn't have that future that your father had, that your grandfather had, that your great-grandfather had. That was pulled away from you by the mismanagement of the Tory government. So James was born in 1969, February 21, and raised by his grandmother and great aunt. His earliest recollections of loving music was ELO. Seems a bit of a strange one, that, but then not necessarily when you look at how some of his melodies have been working up in more recent albums. ELO, or Electric Light Orchestra, are a very harmony heavy band, and you can see where he's getting those influences pulling through. But I think very quickly he discovered punk. He would discover the Clash in particular, and Joe Strummer would become a fast favourite of his. And I think that is really, really evident in not only his playing style, but in his writing and singing style. He would teach himself how to play the guitar. He would mimic, Slash, Johnny Marr, lots of the really, really popular guitarists of the time. He said in Uncut magazine in 2005, all I ever wanted was to make a guitar sound like it was tearing something down. Yikes. And I think if you listen to Generation Terrorist, that is exactly the sound of a guitar tearing something down. Sean Moore was born July 30th, 1968. And as children and cousins, him and James were almost inseparable. He wasn't as loud and out there as a child as maybe some of his peers might have been. Similar to how he is now, he's not known for being the first one to grab a microphone and give an interview. He's not known for being the one that pushes his way to the front of the band. And I think that comes from how he works musically. He is persistent. He is ever there. That driving rhythm, that beat behind the songs, underneath the songs, within the songs, encompassing the songs. Him and Nicky together, awesome, tight rhythm units. But it's those drums. He is always there, always on time. And that mostly comes down to maybe an element of loving colliery music. There's this big thing about, brass bands and that militaristic feel, that regular beat of the big drum as the brass is playing. And he learnt trumpet before he learnt the drums. But I think, he is the backbone of the Manics. There's no denying that. So whether he was a quiet child or whether he is a quiet adult I don't think it matters. It's made a man who drives a band perfectly. In Q magazine in 2002, Nicky Wire said, Sean is the most secret genius in British rock. He says little, but everything he does means something. Nicholas Allen Jones, or Nicky Wire as we know and love him, was born January 20th, 1969. As we know him now, part poet, part provocateur. Part centre-back in glitter. I love that. I heard that in an interview once. I thought, it's just fantastic. He grew up in a fairly political working class family. His father was a former coal miner, so had the direct impact of how the industry had been disseminated within the community. He then went on to be a caretaker. His mum was a dinner lady. But they were both very principled and very proud of their Welsh values. I think that's more than probably where Nicky gets a lot of the central themes for his lyrics. That pride of family, that acute awareness of class struggle. It's something that if you haven't lived it, you can't imitate it. Somebody that hasn't lived in a working class family that may be on a reduced income because of loss of a job, if you've not been through that, you don't know what it feels like. And you might get some of the more, I don't know, were Blair guilty of that to some degree? They were all relatively posh boys, I suppose you could say, and then sang about 18 to 30 holidays and then, Lorette de Mar or Ibiza. Is that really what their experiences were? But you cut back to Nicky and then to the whole of the Manics. They had actually lived that experience. And when they wrote songs, they wrote from experience, from what they saw every day, what they heard every day, and from the people that they loved and admired. Nicky had aspirations of being a footballer when he was young, but that was cut short by an injury. So he settled for music and studying politics at Swansea University. He would go on to write essays on Marxism, the Vietnam War, and his final year dissertation was on Thatcher's legacy. Richie James Edwards was born on December 22nd, 1967, to a more middle-class family, both parents teachers, and that most probably took him away a little bit from the working class struggle that the other three had seen and experienced. By all accounts, he had a quiet and structured family life with lots of literature and art for him to observe and absorb, something which would be seen as he developed in the band as being the person that was giving the quotes, the political direction, the social direction for the band. Growing up, they would all attend Oakdale Comprehensive School. This is where they started to form their real personalities as teenagers. This is where James and Sean met Nicky. This is where James, Sean and Nicky met Richie. And this is where we start to see some of Richie's more significant character traits starting to develop. His fascination with Camus, with Plath, with Deptford, with the films of Pasolini and Coppola. It was said that he consumed media not passively but critically, and making scrapbooks and trying to reframe some of the comments or the meanings behind the things that he had read. I think somebody once referred to it as culture jamming. So at this point we've got four young men with, to some degree, similar-ish backgrounds who have a shared love of music, of football, of politics, of a way of life, of a way of wanting to be. And this, through university, through that early stages of adulthood, pushed them towards forming a band. And Richie was instrumental in, as I've said before, in driving the manifesto of the band. I think it's very clear that Nicky and James were very much on a similar musical wavelength, that they understood each other quite early musically, which is an amazing thing because you don't have that band struggle for a sound. You know, Sean's there with his strict tempos, his really, really beautifully structured drum parts, which would allow the other two to at times just let it all go. And that is one of the things that attracted me to the Manics so early, is that the sound that they created. And yes, there were influences aplenty, and we'll talk about that when we get to the albums. There were some influences that were worn right on their sleeves that you could not avoid, but you could tell almost immediately that they had gelled, that they had cemented themselves together. They had that amazing driving rhythm section of Nicky and Sean, and then the guitar style and sounds of James, and at times of Richie, and then James's voice, which incredibly sounds formed immediately. You know, we've listened to James's voice for, 30 odd years now. We've listened to that voice, and it is still that voice from Generation Terrorists right through to Critical Thinking. It is that voice. Yes, he's got a little bit older and it's got a little bit deeper and it has a little bit more rasp to it, but it is still that voice. And that's an incredible thing, that starting off so early in your career, you found your sound to some degree. And yeah, his influences vocally are there early on, but you can tell it's James, and that is a wonderful thing. The You Love Us podcast is brought to you by the very, very generous sponsorship from the band The Broken and the Dead. They've just released their first album, Fragments and Echoes, which includes the singles Fear, Heaven and How Does It Feel. It's available on all streaming platforms now. And we're not biased. Yes, they're sponsoring this podcast, but it's actually a damn fine album. Give it a try. So it's time to make the band, and when a group of like minds come together and to form a band, one of the things that eventually they have to get round to is picking a name. And thankfully it changed, but originally they called themselves Betty Blue. Yes, it's a reference to a film, and thank goodness they changed that name. It is a generic name at best. The name Manic Street Preachers, as everybody knows, came from a homeless person shouting at James while he was busking, "Hey, it's that Manic Street Preacher again." Thankfully, they chose that name. It was a name that would make them stand out from the crowd. As we're getting closer to Britpop, we're having lots of names like Blair, Oasis, Pulp, Elastica, single word names that just really didn't tell you anything about what the band or the music was going to be. And as soon as you hear Manic Street Preachers, you know there's going to be more to their story, more to their background. And for me, that was one of the things that pulled me in towards them, that they'd taken the time to find a name that meant something. It's one of the things that I still like most about the band is the name. And I know that sounds a bit silly, but it made them stand out. And it is still one of the greatest band names in rock history. In true 1980s action movie style, cue the flames, cue the crap special effects and really bad title cards, but this is the Manic Street Preachers. James Dean Bradfield, the voice and the firepower. Sean Moore, the band's silent architect. Nicky Wire, equal parts feather boa and agitator. Richie Edwards, the beautiful enigma. He turned trauma into art and self-loathing into anthems. Together they became the Manic Street Preachers, intellectual punks in a post-Thatcher world, quoting Camus while channeling The Clash, building manifestos out of distortion pedals and defiance. In 1991, Steve Lamacq said they were a hurricane of glam and grime, like The Clash dressed by Vivienne Westwood. Their self-released debut single, Suicide Alley, in 1988, obviously had the DNA of punk and DIY. When they signed to Heavenly Records, the band doubled down on their ambition. Their goal: release one double album, sell 16 million copies and disband. Aren't we kind of glad that it didn't sell 16 million copies and they didn't disband? Simon Price, author of Everything, a book about the Manic Street Preachers, said they had slogans where other bands had choruses. It was dangerous and exciting. And now we get to 1992 and the release of Generation Terrorists. What an unusual album this is. If we look at the band's punk DNA, you're looking at bands that they loved who were releasing albums with tracks, maybe 8 or 10 tracks, 3 to 3.5 minutes long each track, rattling through. 19 tracks, 76 minutes as a double album, as a debut release. Very, very unusual, but for me, such a success because it encapsulated everything about the band at that time, everything that they had been, everything that they were, and everything that they wanted to be considered until the next release. I think it's an album which has a certain level of naivety about it. They were comfortable enough with their influences, with the bands that they loved, that the bands that they grew up listening to or are currently influenced by. They were comfortable enough to have those influences on show. They didn't try and hide too many things, and people have been critical of that. That people have said, like Q Magazine in 1992, and a debut album that aims to be The Queen is Dead, Appetite for Destruction, and the Communist Manifesto all at once, which is a little bit dismissive, I don't think any band's first or debut album truly nails it straight away, particularly in an arena where politics and message are so important. You know, it might be some lighter pop band that does a classic first album, but what is their message? And I think with bands with a message like The Clash, like the Manics, it is much more difficult to get it exactly right the first time around. But then when you scratch just under the surface, you've found immediate classics in there, you know, Motorcycle Emptiness. You could talk for an hour about the song, about the way that's constructed, about the meaning behind the lyrics, about the social impact that song's had. You know, You Love Us, the song So Good I Stole a Name for this podcast. It is just it's a riot of a song that proclaims that we're so good you have to love us. And I think one of the things for me that the album does is it balances that raw aggression of punk, of, if you look at Guns N' Roses, you know, of that heavier side of rock with unexpected beauty. And, you know, that for me, that comes out in the bonus track, the theme to MASH. I just think that if somebody had told me you're going to listen to 18 tracks of Generation Terrorist, and then that band is going to then produce a cover of a song so beautifully and so respectfully, I would have gone, yeah, sure, mate, yeah. The album was recorded at Great Linford Manor, a studio that had been used by Queen. Being massive Queen fans, it was obviously part of the attraction of using that setting, trying to capture some of the spirit, some of the essence of that. It's been said by many, many bands in the past that recording in spaces that have been used by bands you're a fan of can actually influence your creativity, your writing process while you're there. Nicky Wire once said that we wanted to be Queen with a library card, and maybe that was part and parcel of being in that space. During the recording process, they would ultimately record over 30 tracks for the album, which was then pared down. James said, I had to say everything: politics, pain, beauty, rage, all in one go. It wasn't a process without its ups and downs. You know, there was a pet python at the studio, which would be freely roaming around, you know, just slithering its way through the studio. And Richie was actually terrified of snakes and would actually demand that before he entered a room, it was confirmed as snake-free. Yeah. One of the studio assistants in Uncut magazine in 2009 said Richie was fine with writing about dismemberment and war crimes, but snakes, no thanks. Nicky said they wanted to make the album sound like Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses, only more clever and more angry. Nice. Richie played almost no guitar on Generation Terrorists, but it is evident that his styling is coming through in the lyrics with Nicky. Steve Brown, producer, would say that Richie had his spiral notebook full of quotes, graffiti and slogans. He was like a walking fanzine. So what did I think of Generation Terrorists as an album when I first heard it, and how do I look at it now after all of their songs that reside happily in my head have been written and released? I like it. I'm of an age where punk music, when it broke, I was maybe just a tiny bit too young to be truly, you know, the first wave of punks, but certainly old enough to be on the mid to tail end of it. And Slash and Burn is the album as a whole, but Slash and Burn, the first track, is for me what punk was about. You know, it's a big song. It's a statement of intent. It's just a really, really good song. And I know that is critically lazy. I know that when people go, oh, how do you review this and how do you review that? Just saying, it's a really, really good song. It sounds lazy, but sometimes that's all you can say. Sometimes all you can do is just go, I love this. I love the cowbells. I love the build-up. I love the falsetto in the chorus. Everything about that song just ticks the boxes for me. It tells me, oi, 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 this is the Manic Street Preachers. I think NatWest, Barclays, Midland, Lloyd's is more stereotypical Manic Street Preachers of that time. For me, Generation Terrorist sounds like an album which is recorded in 2 sessions. And I don't mean recorded over 2 days. I mean, they've recorded, half the songs and then gone away for a week and come back and recorded the other half of the songs, because just about half of the songs have got this really, really, really strong punk ethic to them. But then you get some of the other songs which feel more like, I must be getting some stick for saying this, but more like LA rock, more like we're trying to be Guns N' Roses, or we're trying to allow a little bit of, hair metal in there. Hair metal, Jesus Christ, what an awful phrase. But it's an album of influences, and it's an album of contradictions at times, because some of those influences don't necessarily tie into the punk ethic. It's obvious that they are the songs and the sounds and the bands that they love and influence them as they were growing up, from being kids. But it's when they are being more straight punk or aligning more to their punk DNA, for me, that it sounds like the Manics and it has more impact. And again, one man's thoughts is purely subjective. I could go in order and you could go, oh, it's another review. Or I could just say, NatWest, Barclays, Midland, Lloyd's, what a chorus. Come on. How old are these guys at that time? And they write that chorus. You Love Us is a punk song. It's a long punk song. If you look at punk DNA, it would have lasted 2.5 minutes back in the 70s. But it's just a great bloody song. And Repeat UK. I know that now it's not, overly trendy to be anti-monarchistic, but Repeat UK is just love that track. And I suppose that maybe I sound like I'm fanboying a little bit, but why else do you record a podcast about a band if you're not going to fanboy? If it's not your cup of tea that I'm fanboying, then it's really nice that you listen. Thank you very much. But this is what the Manics do to me. They light the fire. They light the passion in me to where I want to listen to the music for the way the music makes me feel. Yeah. Because this music does make me feel something. And, it might be, with Repeat UK, it might be angry, it might be more upbeat, more passionate. With Little Baby Nothing, it makes me think about how women are treated. Okay, on the face of it, it's a rock song and it has a mildly controversial backing vocalist on it, But then when you dig into the lyrics and you think, shit, why is that? Why is that allowed? Why is that necessary? And this is what the Manics have always done for me, whether it be in, their biggest punk moments or their biggest pop moments, they have always made me feel and think. And they're one of the few bands where I will actually go away and look at the lyrics, because, you know, with the best will in the world, not every vocalist can enunciate every word, and we've all seen Peter Kay doing misheard lyrics and all laughed along to that. But you know, when you're listening to a Manics track, there's going to be lyrics in there that you think, oh God, that is amazing. It's like in Motorcycle Emptiness, where he, you know, he's sounding like T.S. Eliot, you know, under neon loneliness, motorcycle emptiness. That is just so simple, but so beautiful. And that, as everybody will tell you, that's the standout track of the album, Motorcycle Emptiness, because that's that moment of collaboration between the band members and the sound engineer and the producer. That's that moment of collaboration where everything aligned, where everything came together, where everybody had exactly the same take on what it wanted to sound like at the end. It is an instant classic, and so many people go, "Oh yeah, that's like an instant classic," but that is. You would be hard pushed to find anybody that doesn't know Motorcycle Emptiness, that doesn't know the Manic Street Preachers, because of that song. You know, that song is wildly successful. You know, the album as a whole sold about, in its initial release, about 225,000 copies. So it was some way short of the 16 million copies they wanted to sell and then disband. But that one song in its own, you know, if we have a look at the downloads on Spotify only as a streaming service, Motorcycle Emptiness has 63.3 million streams or downloads, whichever way Spotify count these. And that's huge. This is a band that started in a little mining town in Wales who wanted to make 16 million and disband, but they've got 63 million downloads of one of their songs. Yeah, it's not Billy Joel Piano Man, which is just past 1 billion downloads. Yes, it's not Taylor Swift. But what is the impact of Taylor Swift's music? Don't know her, never heard of Taylor Swift's song all the way through. But I'm putting money on the Manics being a damn sight more influential. Born to End, for me, is one of their most overtly Clash-influenced tracks. The call backing vocals, it's a great song. I'm not knocking it because it is obviously inspired by the Clash, but it's nice to hear a band being that brave and making it work that well. Love Sweet Exile, again, it's got a really interesting introduction. I'm not a big fan of the drum sound on that track, and I know that's a really weird thing to say. There's something about the drums on it that doesn't sit well with me at all. And then you get to Little Baby Nothing. You know, the way that song is actually produced, it's very poppy, it's very light, it's very open. But its content, its lyrical content, its message is very, very stark to how it sounds. We then get Repeat, Stars and Stripes, which is Manic Street Preachers versus Public Enemy. Does it work? I'm not massively sold on it. At times, if you're old enough, at times it reminds me a little bit of Paul Hardcastle. I mostly get shot down in flames for that. But this is how I feel. And then the first track on the album that I really don't get on with, which is Tennessee, it just feels a bit forced. It feels as though it's not the band performing and gelling together as well as they possibly could do at that time. Now, what happened with Another Invented Disease? I don't know whether they'd had a session listening to Poison or Motley Crue, but that rundown guitar, it's too close for me to Walk This Way by Aerosmith. I know I'm going to get shot down for saying this, but it doesn't. It's like I said before, it feels like an album that's recorded in 2 sessions, and that is in the second session, because you listen to the next track, Stay Beautiful. Stay Beautiful was recorded in the first session with Motorcycle Emptiness, Slash and Burn, NatWest Barclays, Midland Lloyds, You Love Us. That energy, that power, that passion is evident in Stay Beautiful that isn't in Another Invented Disease. And it's Another Invented Disease is, for me, where they allowed too many influences to come in and didn't have complete control over where those influences were going to take that track. Yeah. Whereas Stay Beautiful is a track that they've gone, it starts at middle and it ends this way. It's a more controlled track. It's also a genius track. You know, it's one of those ones which will be in 99% of Manic fans' top 25 songs. You know, it's a dead cert to be in those lists. I remember the first time I listened to So Dead, and that first 16 bars, that first 10 or 15 seconds of the track, I thought it was going to be, because it reminded me of Thunder and Lightning by Thin Lizzy, and I thought it was going to be more of a, in inverted commas, metal track. But they turned it around and it became one of my favourites off the album. It I don't know, do you take that intro, that do you take that away from it? I don't know, but for me, I expected one thing and got something else, and that's another Manics trick. You can't take them on face value. You can't say the song starts like this, it's going to end like this. You've got to listen to the whole track to see that musical sonic journey that they take you on. Spectators of Suicide sounds very Nicky Wire to me. Very, very Nicky all over it. Nicky and Richie. Not just from the title, but from the feel. You know, it's a track which takes its time in telling its message. You know, nearly 5 minutes long is a long track. Does it work? Yeah, I think it does. I think it's a nice change in tempo and atmosphere for the album. I might have pushed it up a little bit earlier in the track listing just to give that break, possibly after Motorcycle Emptiness. But at the same time, you know, this is how our albums are. The running order changes. You know, you look at Generation Terrorist, how many different versions of it are there? The Japanese version, the American version. There's different versions where the running orders change. Damn Dog, I love that little bit. You know, ladies and gentlemen, this is Damn Dog by the Manic Street Preachers. I love that bit at the beginning, but I think that musically it's a little confused. I don't think it knows what it wants to be. I don't get the immediacy of the band trying to get that song out. You know, it's almost a bit like dare I say it, a filler track for the album. Crucifix Kiss and Methadone Pretty, both anthemic. Okay, so these are both songs which are big and have a lift to them. Methadone Pretty is my personal favourite of the two. But I think they're both great tracks. They've both got a lot of definition of the Manic sound, lyrically strong, particularly Methadone Pretty. that there is a story there and the band feels together in both of the tracks. I might even go as far to say that as tracks they could do with another track between them. That's just a personal preference, because I think tempo-wise and I think feel-wise that there is some similarity between them, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I think they could have done with another track in between them just to break that up a little bit, so you could appreciate them both as opposed to one running into another and then condemned to rock and roll. If you were going to have a final track in an album, this is a great way to finish an album. There's a trick. It's a long track, but it's okay because there's enough in it. But the trick where it condemned to rock and roll, there's that musical descendancy. James would go back to that. He would refer to that vocal technique time and time again during the Manics. If somebody was going to be, I don't know, really cynical, could they call this the album's November Rain? God, no. It's not, because there's no fancy pants orchestral movement behind it, but it's the band having that 6 minute 16 to stretch their legs, to breathe out, to throw all of those musical and lyrical influences into one track, and just, but it is in its essence a great rock song. And I think that is when we zoom out and look at the album as a whole, it is a great rock album. Whether it be its punk DNA, whether it be its LA rock DNA, whether it be its Queen DNA, its Clash DNA. There's elements of the Damned, the Ramones in there. There's elements of the Pistols at times, whether it be the philosophy burnt into the lyrics, whether it be Nietzsche or Plath or whoever has influenced them. This is all encapsulated in this one album. And okay, it wasn't the biggest critical success and it wasn't the biggest commercial success, but it put them as a band with their manifesto, their mission statement, on a world stage immediately, and made people sit up and listen. So many bands release albums, release music that doesn't make people sit up and listen, and particularly now, I'll start to sound like an old man now, but now music is released as a commodity, as a means of seeking fame and riches. Back then, I think music was released as a way to tell your story, to interface and collaborate with people that felt what you felt or could identify with what you identified with. And, people can say, oh, that's very punk. Yeah, but it was also very, elements of even lighter music, in the 60s, some of the Beatles, they wrote beautiful, love songs, but people need love songs and identified with love songs and formed relationships off the back of those love songs. So I don't think the time or the style of music is the most important thing there. I think what the most important thing is the intention behind why you're recording it, releasing it, hoping other people will listen to it. And I think that primarily when we look at this album from where we are now, this is the Manics saying, this is who we are. This is who we are now. This is who we are because of the way we grew up. And this is our starting point as a band. Come join us. Come see where we go. Now we arrive at 1993 and the release of Gold Against the Soul. If Generation Terrorists was this sprawling, ambitious album, the album where they put everything that they knew and had into the songs, then Gold Against the Soul felt more like they were being directed down a particular genre, a particular style, more corporatized. It felt fundamentally different to Generation Terrorists. It's a good album. It's got some really, really, really good songs on it. But is it the album that should have followed Generation Terrorists? Obviously, it was the only album that could have followed it. But is it not too much of a juxtaposition in styles at times? It's evident that in some of the tracks, Richie is becoming more and more influential with his lyrics, and his lyrics are becoming more confessional. It's almost as if it's leading us up to the Holy Bible. It's foreshadowing the themes and the stories that would come out. Nicky Wire said in 2009, we just wanted to write songs that sounded big, but we didn't know what we wanted to say. And I think that comes across. You know, it is a much more heavily produced album. There are fewer influences on the sleeves, but when the influences do come on the sleeves, they kind of slap you in the face a little bit. You know, the album, for me, has some of their best work on it, but it also has some work where you think, yeah, you could have maybe left that track off. If I was ever in a position to release an album or to record an album, I would pray to the creative gods or the muses or whatever you want to call them, that my first 5 tracks were as good as the first 5 tracks of Gold Against the Soul. The opening to Sleep Flower, it grabs you, it pulls you in, and it doesn't let you go. It is an amazing, I suppose you want to call it like an opening riff or something like that, but it is an amazing thing to do at the beginning of an album. It sets you up, it says to you, here we go, and I just love it. I remember the countless times I've seen them live, that when Sleep Flower comes on, you just know that when the drums kick in, everything, every hair on your body, every cell in your entire system is going to be jumping because of that. And to take that on to From Despair to Word, yeah, we go a little bit slower, but then we have that rise, that anthemic chorus is unbelievable. For me, La Tristessa is one of the first times we see the true Manic Street Preachers. It's got that moment where James can do his hop, skip and a jump over his guitar cable, as he spins beautifully across the stage. It sets up that manic sound, that soundscape that just expands and keeps on expanding and keeps on expanding, and it's a work of beauty. The lyrics maybe not so, but it is a thing of beauty, and it's one of my personal favourite all-time Manic tracks, because it sets out to say, we don't know this yet, but this is who we're going to become. Yourself could be accused of, I know, being a little bit Metallica, I suppose, but it is much darker. It's lyrically heavy, it's lyrically imposing, but that doesn't reduce the overall impact of the song. And I think sitting between La Tristessa and Life Becoming a Landslide, it kind of mellows the track down a little bit. It allows that transition between the two songs to fit beautifully, because Life Becoming a Landslide is it's an awesome song. It is for me quite poppy. Again, I'm going to get slaughtered for that one. But I think that's because of the melody over the chorus. It's quite light. It's, it's kind of uplifting given the content of the song, but it is a great, great song. It's the perfect length. It's the perfect tempo. It is another Manics classic. I don't know. Then we go to Drug, Drug, Druggy, and I just think that Drug, Drug, Druggy, yeah, it's a fan favourite, but for me, it's just the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And I've never been a massive fan of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And when I heard this track, I just went, oh dear. I don't mind influences sitting on your sleeve. Guns N' Roses as an influence is, it's kind of like a generic rock influence, and the Clash is a generic punk influence. Yeah, I get slated for those as well. But the Red Hot Chili Peppers is too much of a sound, and this track suffered greatly because of that, which is a great pity, because by the time you get away from the Red Hot Chili Peppers influenced intro, it turns into a proper Manic song, and there's got to be some label pressure there. Use a hook at the beginning to make it, I don't know, appealing to a wider audience or something like that. The beginning I dislike immensely, but the rest of the song just kicks ass as it goes on. We'll just stop for a couple of thoughts about the album at this point. It was the most alien sounding record we've made. We didn't feel like we belonged anywhere. James Dean Bradfield and the NME in 1994. Reviews, NME, at the time, polished, professional and weirdly aloof. The Manics have lost some blood, but gained control. Melody Maker, not as wild-eyed or feral, but there's a sinister beauty behind the sheen. And Q Magazine gave it 3 out of 5, praising Sleep Flower, but calling the record confused and overproduced. I would tend to agree with the overproduced comment. It was something that I felt immediately upon hearing it. Richie said at the time that the album was much more personal, that the album was much more unhappy. I'm not sure I agree with him there. Nicky Wire called it confused but beautiful, like a teenage breakdown in album form, and Bradfield said it was beautifully crafted, but that the band felt directionless during the process. And I think at times that does come out. Roses in the Hospital was a track where they took the Chili Peppers influences again, but did it properly. They subdued that influence into a level that allowed it to be a Manics track, and it is a massive success as a song. It's different to the tracks that come before it. It's different to everything on Generation Terrorist. It's a nice change in direction whilst maintaining their identity, their manifesto. It's another one, lazy reviewing. It's another great song, but it's another great song, and it's one that I think at times gets unfairly criticised for not being Manics enough. And so we get to the final 3 tracks on the album. Nostalgic Pushed, for me, it's the last Manic song on the album. I love the intro, love the build up to it. But then it kind of just falls apart a little bit. We go back to the Red Hot Chili Peppers on Symphony for Tourette's, and then we go into Faith No More for Gold Against the Soul. Lost opportunities or experimentation or label pressure. I'm putting it on label pressure. Gold Against the Soul is way too long as well. 5:35 for a track that isn't that strong is way too long. Nostalgic Push sounds like a song where the band are gelling. It sounds like a song where they want to be recording. Symphony of Tourette's and Gold Against the Soul sound the exact opposite. They sound like they're going through the numbers to some degree, particularly Gold Against the Soul. It sounds like they've been given an instruction there. It's not one of my favourite songs of theirs, but it still has enough manicness in it to belong on this album. The album as a whole, then, I find it impossible to be overly critical against this album just because of the way it starts. Those first 5 tracks are just, for me, solid gold. They sorry for the pun there, but they are just 5 great tracks. They're just, and again, I talked about in Generation Terrorist, was it an album of 2 sessions? Is this an album of 2 sessions where the first 5 tracks are recorded once and then next week they come back and do the other 5 songs? I don't know, it's impossible to tell, but that differential is quite marked when you're listening to it. You listen to 5, you go, yeah, great. And then you listen to the other 5 and then you go, descending. Not as good, not as good, not as good, not as good. So, they often talk about the second album, the second film being much more difficult to produce to get the end result that you want. And I think Gold Against the Soul is something that suffers from second album itis, if there's such a word. I still listen to it. I still love it. Predominantly the first 5 tracks. But I'm still excited whenever they play a track off there. Some of those starting riffs, particularly Sleep Flower. Sleep Flower will stay with me forever as one of the greatest lift me up openings to a track ever, irrespective of band. And I think that the Manics ticked a lot of boxes with this album. But then it led us in a completely different direction, didn't it? And in the next episode we'll go there. It's not a comfortable journey where we're going next, and we're going to the Holy Bible, as you'll all know. An album of very difficult subject matter, very difficult time for the band, very difficult time for fans. It was at the time it was a love or hate album. I know I struggled to get into it, but more of that in the next episode. Generation Terrorists, it didn't sell 16 million copies. They didn't disband afterwards. Thank God for that. But what they did do is they gave us, in my opinion, one of the most important debut albums, because it set its stall out. It said, this is us. And because of this album, you will love us. Hopefully you'll stay with us for as long as we want to stay around. And I think for me personally, and I know a lot of you out there feel exactly the same thing, this is why I stuck with the Manic Street Preachers, because honesty breeds trust, and we just want good music we can trust. So this is the end of episode 1 of You Love Us. Thanks again to The Broken and the Dead for sponsoring the podcast. Deeply appreciate that. Keep your thoughts coming in. We've had quite a few letters. We've had some offers of collaboration as well. So we'll be doing some interviews later on in the series. But keep your stories coming in, whether it be through Instagram or through the email. Let us know why you love the Manics, why, or what you think of the album. Let me know if you think I am talking absolute bull, in my opinion, about the tracks. Tell me if you think I'm spending too much time talking about one thing or not enough about another thing. This is a podcast that I wanted to make for others so that they could enjoy the Manics as much as I do. This is one man's thoughts. This is one man's opinions going into a community which is very, very passionate about the band. And, I hope I hit the appropriate point with a lot of you out there. I'm not afraid of criticism, but I prefer praise, like we all do. So for the first episode. Thank you very, very much for listening. Thank you to everybody out there, and I mean everybody, for the support they've shown from when we've been advertising that the podcast is coming out. It's been amazing. So until next time, stay beautiful.